Now, have you ever wondered which country in the world makes the best cars? There's the big five, so there's Italy, there's Germany, there's France, there's Japan, and there's the USA. I'm going to do a series of videos, one on each country, picking the top 5 or 6 best cars ever produced, in order to go for a final shootout in a last video and decide which country in the world is producing the very best cars. In this video, we're going to talk about Italy, and it is indicative of how many incredible cars Italy has produced, how difficult I found to get this shortlist. I've also made a point of not picking the most obvious cars. There's a couple of well-known cars in there, but there's some oddball choices as well, because I was keen to pick cars which were not just well-known and iconic and famous and desirable, but also cars that had had a big impact in the way they had shaped the car industry in years to come. To give you an example, it was a difficult choice, but one of the cars that I held out on was the F40. Now, it is a car that is on everybody's lips. It's a beautiful car. It was the first car to hit 200 miles an hour, but really, that's just a figure. In terms of the design, the engineering, it wasn't particularly advanced. It didn't move things forward significantly. It was just an evolution of everything else that was happening at the time. So I've decided, although it is a very worthy car, not to include it in my list. So the first couple of cars that I'm going to pick may surprise you. It's not that they're not obviously good cars, they are, but perhaps they wouldn't immediately spring to mind as some of the very best that Italy had ever produced. And the first is the Alfa Romeo 105 Series Giulia GTA. Why am I picking this car? Well, there's a lot of reasons for it, but it was absolutely seminal and transformative. You all know now about the BMW M cars, the AMGs, all the hot super saloons that have been produced in the last 20 or 30 years. Well, Alfa Romeo was doing that, picking up a humdrum standard saloon car or coupe and making it a very special racing-based car way before anyone else did. And the GTA is probably the most significant of all. So it was based on the Giulia 105 platform, which in itself was a very, very good car. Disc brakes all round, independent suspension at the front, quite a trick sort of rear suspension setup. It had a very advanced alloy engine and a 5-speed gearbox. For the time, it was pretty much up there at the top. But what Alfa Romeo did next was just astounding. It's the attention to detail that makes the GTA so special. The bodywork was all aluminium. The inner panels, which were still made of steel, were made of thinner gauge steel to make it still lighter. It had magnesium alloy wheels, it had plastic side windows, it had aluminium rear upper control arms and lightweight interior trim. The engine had a new twin spark cylinder head, 2-barrel 45mm Weber carburetors instead of the normal 40mm ones, and even a magnesium camshaft cover, sump, timing cover and bell housing. The transmission gear ratios were closer than standard and the gears were machined for lightness and quicker shifting. All this meant that the Giulia GTA was a huge success on the racetrack. In this trim, it weighed just 750 kilos. But the thing that gets me about it, as I mentioned, is how transformative it was for the rest of the industry. The next car will almost certainly surprise you, because it's not that well known. It has appreciated in certain years, but for a long time it was in the doldrums. They weren't particularly sought after. Nobody really wanted them, what they do now. The car I'm talking about is a Maserati Bora. Why am I talking about this car? Well, there were supercars of all shapes and sizes and types, and they all had independent suspension. They had V8s, they had V12s. This pretty much, contrived to that template in many ways. It was powerful, it was very fast, but what really differentiated it from anything else at the time was that it was incredibly usable. Now, we all think that the NSX was the very first car that made supercars a day-to-day proposition. Now, perhaps in terms of reliability, the Bora wasn't quite there, but in terms of usability, of comfort, it was way ahead any other supercar of the time. It had a very usable, quite large boot. It had a seating position that, unlike all the other Italian exotics, was tailored so that you could change it to suit whatever size you were. The pedals were movable, the steering column was movable, it had aircon, it had electric windows. Now I know all this kind of stuff now sounds like absolutely nothing, but you have to understand at the time, if you get into one of the cars that were competing against it, this was absolutely revolutionary. Now we move on to a couple of more obvious choices, and the first one of those is the Lancia Stratos. Now, there was a few Lancias which I could have picked from. Lancia's an incredible manufacturer of cars, way ahead of its time. Its reputation now is much diminished because of what happened in the sort of 80s and 90s, but it was an incredible manufacturer. The Stratos, which was actually made during Fiat's tenure, was a very special car because it moved on the concept of the rally car from something that was just changed from a street car to a bespoke car. This was the first car which was designed and run purely as a rally car. It won 3 world championships, and it would have probably won more if Fiat hadn't suspended the funding to move it on to some of the other Fiat projects. It is another stunning work of Bertone's Marcello Gandini. The Stratos featured a mid-mounted Ferrari V6 engine from the Dino, had a 5-speed transmission, and it was built as a homologation special, so only 492 ever left the factory. And I think it's true to say that the Stratos revolutionised rallying by making it more radical, more experimental, changing the sport forever and pushing the boundaries of sports car design to a whole new level. The next car you will also know. It is the very famous, very beautiful Lamborghini Miura. Now there are several stories that circulate about why Ferruccio Lamborghini decided that he was going to build his own supercars. After all, he was just a lowly tractor manufacturer. I think the most attendable story I have found so far is that he had several Ferraris and he wasn't the best driver, so he kept on burning out all the clutches. He went to see Enzo about this, and Enzo literally just laughed him out of the office. He was so offended that he thought, I'm never going to buy a Ferrari again, I'm going to make my own, and I'm going to make a competing car. The Miura was born in 1966, and initial development was actually against Ferruccio's wishes, who preferred the GT type cars. And as soon as it came out though, it was revolutionary. It was the fastest thing around. It was mid-engined, it was 2-seater. It basically started the template of what supercars in the future, or from that point on, were going to be. Now, it wasn't perfect. Certainly there were some, in typical Lamborghini Italian fashion, the cars were released before they were ready, so that the initial owners really were the test beds and the development for the Miuras. I think there were 3 separate evolutions of the Miura which were slowly improved. There were problems like aerodynamics with high lift at speed. There was also an issue with the engine oil being shared with the gearbox, which caused some problems, but ultimately there is no denying just how influential the Miura was. So back down to earth for the next one, which is a much more attainable car, but absolutely legendary in my mind. And it was a little bit of a toss-up with this one between this and also the Fiat Panda, which is another very, very clever little car. But in the end, I had to opt for the classic 500 Fiat 500. This sold in 3.9 million units, which, especially for the 60s and 70s, is an astounding number of cars. But it was how intelligently it was designed, which really takes it apart from the rest of these cars. It's never easy, but it's relatively easy with unlimited resources and selling a car for whatever money you want to make a car that performs certain functions. But when you make a car that has to appeal to a large number of people and has to be as cheap as possible whilst being able to undertake lots of different roles, well, then it is a truly special thing. And the 500 was just that. It was incredibly well designed. It was a tiny car, and yet it would seat 4 people. It was incredibly slow, yes, but it was still fun to drive. And the thinking behind it was the simplicity, the ease of maintenance also meant that initially spare parts were available from local newsagents. So they really just thought of everything to make this a car that would work for the ordinary person. It was also unbelievably cute. For me, the 500 is one of the most influential cars of all time. Drive one today. I bought one in Italy and drove it all the way back here and loved every minute of it. But drive one today, and once you get used to it, take a little while to get used to how slow it is, but once you get used to it, you'll be amazed by how much fun they are. Now, whatever my picks were, they're always going to be controversial, and I am open to suggestions for the final video. In your comments, tell me what you think should be in here, maybe that I haven't added. And if you can convince me, I will add it to the shortlist for the final video where we have the shootout between the different various countries, the 5 or 6 cars from each country. Also, I think there have to be a few honourable mentions. I said the F40 before, it is an incredible car, so I think it is worth keeping it in mind. The Pagani Zonda, which is a more modern car, is also pretty incredible because it was really everything that the Countach was, minus the bad parts. Dramatic, incredible to look at, but it was also reliable, relatively easy to drive. So really groundbreaking, especially when you consider the Pagani didn't really exist before '99. What an achievement from those guys as well. Then there is the 250 GTO, an incredible car from Ferrari, but really almost an all-out racing car. Only 36 were produced, so I decided not to include it in this list. Finally, 2 more honourable mentions. The Lancia Delta Integrale, incredible car. Obviously, in the end I decided the Stratos was a little bit more cutting edge because I said it revolutionised the way rally cars were made and their intended purpose. But the Integrale was incredibly successful as well. And lastly, what I consider to be the most beautiful car of all time, the Alfa 33 Stradale. Again, made in very low numbers, but surely one of the most painstakingly beautiful cars ever made, with a race V8 in it as well. That is my absolute dream car. Thank you all so much for watching. Do let me know what you think, what your choices would be, and see if you can change my mind and get your car into the final video.